For those of you who are aware of my social media presence, you will be aware that I have written a book, and you might actually be tired of me posting about my book. That's actually the only thing I really post about. I'm not big on social media. Like, in other words, I don't have a big presence on social media, but I am excited that I was able to fulfill what had been a dream of mine for a long time and write a book, and have been encouraged by the response to the book, which has been way more than I ever imagined. I've been blown away. Right now, the book is in reprint because it's sold out. And so my publishers, that is Illumination Publishers, are working on a reprint. What I did want for just a few minutes, though, for those who haven't heard my interview done by Rob Skinner. So Rob Skinner interviewed me for his podcast and interviewed me about the book. Some of you will be aware and would have already listened to the interview, but for those who haven't, after this clip, I'm going to then try to provide the audio from that interview. And so if that works, then once I'm done with this intro, then you'll have the audio of the interview where Rob Skinner from Tucson, Arizona, interviewed me about the book. To all those who've bought the book, who've read the book, who've provided feedback, I'd like to say a huge thank you. Some of you may have read the book, but not necessarily provided feedback. Still, I say a really huge thanks. This has meant so much to me, and I hope that the book will be of much encouragement. The title of the book is Go in the Strength You Have. And the subtitle is Looking Beyond Your Weaknesses to See the Difference Your Life Can Make. And that's really what the book is about. Not so much ignoring our weaknesses, but also not looking only as far as those weaknesses. Now, these weaknesses could be real or perceived, but not just focus on the weaknesses in a sense where it pulls us back, but to look beyond, to have a vision for our lives far beyond those weaknesses and really see the difference that our lives can make.
I'm Rob Skinner, and this is the Rob Skinner Podcast. On this episode, I talked to Rhysce Osanya from New Jersey. Rhysce went on the mission team to Nairobi, Kenya in the late 80s. And from there, he went on to plant more churches in Eldoret, Kenya, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and Kigali, Rwanda. He just finished a memoir of his missionary and charity work in Africa entitled, Go in the Strength You Have, Looking Beyond Your Weaknesses to See the Difference Your Life Can Make. I read the book and talked with Rhysce about his experiences in Africa. All this and more on the Rob Skinner Podcast. Rhysce, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Robin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you've written a book called Go in the Strength You Have, Looking Beyond Your Weaknesses to See the Difference Your Life Can Make. I've read the book. It's a great book, and I hope it sells really well. But in it, you share about your missionary experience, your life serving on the mission field in Africa, helping out with hope. You've offered advice to singles. It's a very, very interesting book, and I look forward to talking to you about some of the experiences you had in it. Let's start with this question. How did you become a Christian?
Yeah, sure. And, thank you so much for those kind words. And it's been a joy writing the book. So I'll go back to when I was in first few years of elementary school. At that point, I was living in Ethiopia. So my dad worked in Ethiopia. My family lived in Ethiopia. And the school that we were at was a Canadian mission school. So that was my first exposure to the Bible. And I loved the Bible. I didn't read the Bible much, but I loved the Bible. Bible stories. I remember once playing the role of Goliath in a little David and Goliath skit. And so then later on, fast forward for high school, I ended up at a Catholic school. And at that point in my life, I had a drive to get to know Jesus. And I can't remember if it's more like when I got to the school the atmosphere gave me that drive, or if I had the drive and it was just a great a synergy there. But so there were different things. We'd have to go to mass, in the chapel, and I was impressed. The stained glass windows, and it was like, for me, it was like a very holy atmosphere.
Right.
And also once a semester, you'd have one-on-one conversations with a priest. And so actually, I wanted to buy into that. And so if they had let me in, I would have. That's the direction I wanted to take. But what they said was, I guess they were very careful not to try to convert people. So what they told me was, whatever your family's church is, go there. And we didn't really have a church, but my dad had some allegiance. So there's a church I went to. I wasn't getting much out of church, but we did get to play soccer, after Sunday school. So I enjoyed that. But then, that fell off. And then after that, my family, we moved to Morocco because my dad got a job in Morocco. And my last few months in Morocco, at that point, I was done with high school and I was prepared to, move back here to the States for college. And there was a little church. It was called the American Church in Tangier. So that was the city, Tangier, in northern Morocco. And I didn't used to attend the church. I don't even remember like how I knew about this, but they brought in this energetic young guy. And, so he was doing Bible lessons. So he just gathered, I think because our school was called the American School of Tangier. So I guess, you have Americans there or people who speak English. So that was a great target group. And so during the summer, he had all sorts of activities and he was such a fun guy. I was like, wow, like he's Christian, he's fun. And then for me, my ambition was to be a professional soccer player. That was everything for me. My twin brother and I, that's an ambition that we had. And so this particular gentleman, he had been a football player. And so just part of him sharing his life was about how as much as football was his dream, he had put that aside because of the gospel. And so many things were attracting me about him. And so, so we had a great time for a couple months. And then, so I asked them, so I'm going back to the States now. Where should I go to church? And they told me, okay, when you get there, wherever your college is, find a Baptist church in town and go there. And so that was the answer. And I remember asking myself, why a Baptist church? Like, why are they sending me there in particular? So that was a question in my head. And then, so I got to college. I was at Williams College. That's in Williamstown, Massachusetts, way up in the Berkshire Hills. And I was on the soccer team. And guess what? One of the biggest fans, maybe the number one fan of the soccer team, was the local Baptist pastor. And so he'd be at the soccer practices and everything. So he's right there. So I'm like, I was told to go to a Baptist church. There's a Baptist pastor right here. He's a soccer fan. I'm on the soccer team. And so I eventually went there a couple of times. And I have nothing against the Baptist church. But I remember that I would leave there feeling like I didn't quite get anything from it. And the pastor would be at the door at the end. And, as we leave, he'd shake our hands. And now, truth be told, I really wasn't doing a lot. There was room for me to have more initiative. But that's what kind of struck me. And I thought, okay, yeah, he's a great soccer fan. He's a preacher. But I just felt a lack of, I didn't feel that there was anything beyond that. And then in my freshman year, because I had tried to be a Christian. I didn't know what a Christian was, but I tried to be a Christian. I liked the Bible. And in my freshman year, so one of the things that I tried to stay clear of was, improper sexual relations. The other things I tried to avoid, some of it was just because I was into sports, things like smoking and drinking and stuff. But in my freshman year, so I got involved at one point with one of my female colleagues, and I felt it was poor decision making on my part, but like I felt that I was strained. And so I remember saying, you know what, I need to go back to the Baptist church. I need to see the pastor and I need to talk to him. But then another voice told me, but when I was there, he didn't really show any interest. And so I decided I wasn't going to go there. In the end, that relationship ended, and it ended because the girl dumped me. That was incredibly embarrassing. Uh, she was a senior, I was a freshman. It was just a lot of things, but anyway, she dumped me. Then I ended up with another girl who was a freshman, just like I was. And again, it was an improper relationship. The difference now is she said she was Christian. And I remember having a conversation with her, and I thought, no, this can't be right. And you know the usual line, you know, as long as we love each other, it's okay. And that was her line. I still felt this can't be right, but I was still in it. Hmm. Then the academic year came to an end, so I came back to New York. She's from Los Angeles, so she went to LA. So here I was back in New York, and I was just burning with my desire to get my life right. Hmm. And guess what happened? One day I was, I'd gone to look for my sister. She was working in Manhattan. I didn't get her. She had left already. So I was on my own heading back home. I was staying with her, and I got out of a subway train. And as I got out of the subway train, there was somebody standing on the platform. He told me his name, and he said, "I'd like to invite you to a Bible discussion." And I know I thought this in my head. I don't know if I asked him, but I kind of wondered, like, but why did you ask me? Because clearly several people had gotten off the train ahead of me. But it was amazing, because in our conversation, he ticked the boxes of all the things I was looking for. He said it was a non-denominational church. Because remember, I had that question, why was I being asked to go to a Baptist church? Yet there's so many different churches. Right. There's only one Bible. Why are there so many different churches? So when he said non-denominational, he had me. Then we had a conversation, and I really didn't know Brooklyn very well, because as much as I was born in New York, I grew up outside of the States. And I'd been wanting to find a place where I could play soccer and stay in shape ahead of the next season. And he was like, yeah, come, I can take you to where we'll play soccer. And then also he was kind of an international guy. And so that's what I had been looking for, just kind of like an international group of people. Because in my freshman year at college, what happened was I just felt like there was unspoken racial division. So even in the dining halls, you'd have a bunch of Black students, and they'd kind of like all be in one corner. And I just wasn't really comfortable with that. So all the three things I was looking for seemed to be represented by this gentleman: a non-denominational church, an international mixed flavor, and soccer. So I had no idea where, like, the address for that Bible discussion. So instead we agreed I'll go to church. Because if anything's in Manhattan, I can find it. Take a subway train, and it's very findable. That was a Friday. I said, hey, listen, call me. Make sure I wake up on Sunday. I'll be at church. And I woke up long before his phone call, got to church. And, from there we had Bible studies. Some I really enjoyed. Others were really challenging. But then ultimately, some of the amazing men in the Bible studies, there was a brother, Greg Eller, Mitch Mitchell, an amazing, amazing man. He's now in Triangle. He was in Brooklyn at the time. And they helped me reach a decision. And so what happens, at one point I was stalling with my decision. And then at midweek service, they used to have a class for visitors. And so I remember going to the visitors class. And Steve Kennard was teaching that class. So Steve Kennard, right now he's in Hudson Valley, still with the New York church. And there's a statement he made. I don't remember anything else he said, but one thing he said. He said, there's some of you here tonight who, if you don't make a decision to become a disciple now, you might never make that decision. And I thought, you know what? He's right. And so that night, I decided to make Jesus Lord. There was still more to discuss, but that night, I was all in. Part of the challenge, by the way, was that as we were studying the Bible, there was a discussion about me leaving Williams College, that I needed to be in New York and to be with the church and to be surrounded by the members of the church. And so if I was going to get baptized, then I needed to leave Williams College. And so that was one of my challenges. I had because I had come over, like I said, I did high school in Morocco. I came here and was with my sister briefly in Brooklyn and went straight to Williams College. That's kind of all I had. And Williams College is also it's a pretty a good college. It's highly ranked. It's part of what they call the Little Ivy. It's a bunch of liberal arts colleges in mostly in the Northeast. And that was a heavy one, but in the end, I decided, yep, it does make sense. If I go back up there, I see myself just going back to my old life, because there wasn't as much communication as there is now. Now you have internet, phone. I mean, it's super easy to stay in touch even when people are at a distance. So I decided to leave Williams College. I did not consult my dad or anybody. It was my decision, and I made the decision, and decided to stay in Brooklyn, be with the church, get baptized. And, I called my soccer coach. I said, Coach, I'm leaving Williams. I'll be staying in New York. And so that's how I became.
Wow. What year was that?
That was 1988.
Okay, 1988. Okay, great time in the kingdom. Lots of stuff going on. Church in New York had been there about 5 years. I'm sure it's around 1,000 people at that point. I don't know how big it was, but I know it was pretty.
I think about that. Yep. And we were meeting at the Beacon Theater on Sundays.
Okay. As you talk, Rhysce, and you go by Rhysce as well as Raiola, you've got nickname Rhysce. It reminds me a little bit of an earlier conversation I had with Hervé Florent, because he also grew up overseas and very international background. I mean, he was, born in Haiti. He went to school in France. He went to school in Spain. I mean, he speaks English, Creole, Spanish, French. I mean, now Arabic, and who knows what other tribal languages he picked up while he was in Africa. But it really must have given you a very interesting perspective on life to be in Ethiopia, Kenya, Morocco, and then come back to the States. You must have felt a little bit like I don't quite fit in here with my people in my same age.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention Hervé, because Hervé is incredibly dear friend of mine. He and his wife Janet have had a indelible impact in my life, in my wife's life, in our family, which I also write about in the book. So he was born in Boston, by the way.
Oh, Boston. Okay, that's right. His dad was, I believe, a composer or musician. I mean,
right.
It's got
a music professor.
Just an amazing person. But anyway, interesting. Now, why did you write this book? You most people talk about it. Few people actually do. You wrote a book about your missionary experience. What prompted you to write it?
I'd say several things, and one is that I love writing. It's something I've enjoyed. The strange thing is I don't like reading. But, I love writing. Now, I don't know what that says about me, that I'd rather talk than listen, but I love writing. And so I've long wanted to write a book. And for me, it's just kind of like, because I love writing, I'd like to write a book. It's kind of like, to me, if you're in the NFL,
right,
you want to get to the Super Bowl.
Right.
You don't just want to be in the NFL. If you're in Hollywood, then you want to get an Oscar. You want to hold a statue. So it wasn't even so much, I don't know if we're like, let's say, prominence. I'm trying to write a bestseller. I just wanted to write.
Right.
And have a book. And there were times I put some things together, and I thought to myself, I could develop this into a book. But that didn't quite happen. I had different ideas over the years, because I remember now when my wife and I, when we were engaged, and I was advised to read several books, and I bought several books, and I love them. Books about marriage, books about engagement. And I thought, you know what? I want to contribute. I want to write a book about marriage.
Right.
And then it very soon became clear to me that when it comes to marriage, I need to be reading rather than writing. So that idea it wasn't put on the shelf. It was this. Okay, I'm going to read. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read when it comes to marriage. But one day it kind of hit me. And actually, what happened? I went back to Kenya for the 25th anniversary service of the Nairobi church. And a few of the mission team members were there. Not all of the mission team members managed to make it. And they found a role in that church service for each of the mission team members who made it. And so, a sister and I, her name is Deanne, for our role was to cut the cake. There was a big celebratory cake. So we got to say a few words before cutting the cake. And so what I said then is what later pretty much became the book, because it stuck with me. And what I said was that when the church was planted on that mission team, I was the weak link. Now, Rob, I wasn't saying that to gain people's sympathy or, because I wanted to get hugs. I was a weak link. You ask any of the guys on that mission team, I was the weak link. And yet at that point in time, at the 25th anniversary service, I was able to look back and see that my life had made a difference. I'm not saying that I was amazing or I was incredible, but my life had made a difference. There were people sitting there who could come to me and would say, thank you. And that's what I thought, you know what? Even the weakest link can have an impact and make a difference.
Wow. It definitely comes through in the book. And we're going to talk more about that, but let's just talk about, how did you end up going back to Nairobi? It's kind of an interesting story. You lived in Kenya, but then you were converted in New York, you end up going back. What was it like for you to leave New York and return to Kenya? I mean, you're born in the States, but you're going back to a place you grew up for part of your upbringing.
Yeah, for me, going back to Kenya was very exciting. And I had just one thought, because, to a large extent, I didn't really know what to expect. I was 19 years old when Jim Brown came to me and said, join our mission team. And again, it was my decision. It's not, nobody in my family agreed with the decision, or it didn't make sense to anybody in my family. One thing I would say for my dad, as much as he didn't approve of my decision, he was supportive. Okay, he probably thought I was crazy. And then at that age, I didn't see why everyone else thinks this is so crazy. It's kind of like, hey, I'm a disciple. Let's do this. But one thought that I had is this: if I'm doing this for God, it's going to work out okay. So that was the one thing that I took with me, as I left New York and went back to Nairobi. And for me, it also represented an opportunity to make a difference.
Wow.
Because growing up, as a child in Kenya, there's a point where I wanted to make a difference. This is like when I was in 5th grade. And so I thought about different people who had made differences. And I thought, you know what, they all got killed. Because I thought about politicians. I thought about people like Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
So I thought, I don't want to get killed. So I don't want to go that route. But I remembered that at this point, when I was called on to the mission team, I had always wanted to make a difference. And at this point, it wasn't, death. Okay, it's not like my life was at stake, but the point was, this was an opportunity to make a difference, which is what I'd always dreamed to be able to do.
Okay, so in the book, you talk about how people didn't know that you had spent time in Kenya. Can you talk a little bit about that? It was kind of a secret. So can you talk a little bit about how that got discovered?
All right. People in New York, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So what happened was, so even as I got baptized, because I'm, my dad's from Kenya, my mom's from New York. I was born in New York. I was raised in Kenya. So, there's both elements in there. So even as I, studied the Bible and got baptized, those around me knew that there was a Kenyan connection. And at that time, the New York church was planning to plant the church in Kenya. So that used to be talked about a lot. So in general, it was talked about. The New York church was going to plant a church in Kenya, as well as Zimbabwe at the time. And then, a couple that I really loved, still love them, Rhysce and Daisy Ogwaya. Rhysce has since passed on and gone on ahead of us. But Daisy, she and I were at Brooklyn College together. And then Rhysce and Daisy, they were engaged, and they were on the mission team. So that conversation was a kind of a constant conversation. But I didn't want to go back to Kenya. That I didn't. And so I remember I eventually got to know people, other people who were on the mission team, apart from Daisy and Michi. And so I went to the wedding of a couple who were also part of the mission team. Now, looking back, that wasn't a very wise decision. If I'm trying to avoid getting on the Kenya mission team, why am I going to a wedding of a couple that's on the mission team and other mission team members are going to be there? But so at some point I met Jim Brown. I made sure I didn't tell him too much about me. But then later on, as I recall, he was having a conversation with Nietzsche. It was either Nietzsche or it was Alcides, one of the others. And they're like, I know Raiola. Yeah, he's Kenyan. So, well, one day I'm at work, I get this call from Jim, because I had given him my number. Again, bad move if I didn't want Jim following up on me.
Right.
And so, he asked me onto the mission team.
Okay, that's a crazy story. Okay, so you mentioned Alcides. Alcides was on an earlier podcast that I interviewed him, and he's from Brazil. What was he doing going on a mission team to Kenya? What's the connection there?
My understanding of the connection is, so Mike and Anne Brigitte Tolliver had led the church planting to Sao Paulo. And that's where Alcides became a Christian. And then Leslie had been a part of that mission team as well. And Leslie and Alcides were dating at the time.
I see.
So I believe that the Tollivers were the connection.
Okay.
And so the Tollivers, I believe, called them to be part of the team.
Yeah.
And, so there was Alcides, even in New York. He didn't know English, but was up there. He was doing communion messages and getting himself ready for Kenya. So I think that's how he made it on the team.
Pretty bold. Okay. Now, this is what I find really interesting about your book, Raiola, is that you mentioned being afraid a lot. You mentioned having weaknesses. You just mentioned being the weak link. But as a reader, it seems every time that you were called to do something bold or crazy, you did it. I mean, you ended up pushing past it. So where did that come from? You mentioned in the book about Bible algebra. You say, let's see if I can find it here. You said, the strength that you have plus God's mighty power equals no need to be scared, doubtful, or anxious. You've got a lot of little aphorisms like that, little maxims that are sprinkled throughout the book. But it strikes me as like, this guy is really gutsy. And yet you portray yourself as really terrified. But when push came to shove, you always said yes.
First of all, let me say this. I love algebra. So not calculus, not anything deeper, but I really enjoy algebra and handling algebraic equations. So, it's kind of like even when, we study the Bible with people and, Acts 2:38, repentance plus baptism equals forgiveness of sins and Holy Spirit. I just love that. For me, that just makes sense. And so, as far as I see it, your BA is when you're born again. That's your first degree, your BA, you're born again. That's the first equation,
right?
From Acts 2:38. Then you graduate to your MBA, your master's in Bible algebra. You're now a disciple, and now you're called to push out a bit more. You go in the strength you have, together with God's power. And at that point, there is no need to be afraid. And so coming back to your question in terms of how did I push past that, to be honest, and I know I mentioned this in the book, sometimes I was too afraid to say no, to be really honest with you. Even when Jim called me, onto the mission team to Kenya, I just thought, like, how can I say no? I am a disciple, and I'm calling myself a disciple. We're here to make disciples. We're here to, win the world for Christ. How can I say I stand for that and then say, no, I'm not going to Kenya? So sometimes, Rob, I was too afraid to say no. So I said, it's kind of like out of weakness. And other times, I would say I was kind of like pushed in. People with very good motives were pushing me, helping push me. I think, I don't know if you've heard of this story, where there was a king who had a daughter and he wanted her to get married. And so he got a bunch of gentlemen and, who wanted to marry his daughter. and they said, you've got to prove yourself. So there was a stretch of river. It had alligators and all sorts of water creatures that are undesirable and lethal. And so you had these guys lined up, and suddenly one guy is in the water and he's navigating his way, and he gets to the other side, and the king is like, yes, because the offer, there was his daughter, there was what do you want? There's, just name it. And the guy says, I want the guy who pushed me in. And so I think many times I was pushed in by people who had enough vision for me to say, you know what, Rhysce, you can do this. And then another thing for me, at a certain point, it just made sense to step out of my comfort zone. Wow. And that's what we see, for example, with Gideon. That's what we see with Moses. That's what we see throughout the Bible. Fishermen who became apostles, tax collectors, they had to go out of their comfort zone to really make a difference. And then the men and women on the mission team were amazing, incredible examples. I couldn't be around them and not at certain points just step beyond my weaknesses and my fears.
Right.
That made a huge
difference. It makes such a huge difference, the people that you're in immediate contact with. One of those is Bob Stia. He's in the church here in Tucson, and I know you know him. He told me a story about how he got selected to go to Africa, and he said that prior to that, he's like, man, I feel sorry for anyone who's going to Africa. I never want to go to that. And like shortly afterwards, he got invited to go on the mission team. I just thought that was hilarious. You guys must have been brothers from another mother or something like that. But it seemed like he had a very similar experience.
And Bob's incredible. Bob's amazing. And in the book, I write about, among other things, the other men who were on that mission team,
right?
Even the women who were on that mission team, just incredible people. Because I look at myself, I was going back to Kenya, reluctant as I was,
right?
But I had grown up. There was familiarity. For the others, this was like, it's kind of like what you're saying. Like Bob had never been to Kenya. Why go to Kenya?
Right.
And I admire that they made that decision.
Right. Okay, but here's what really surprised me, and I want to read a passage from your book. And it says, okay, you went and planted a church in, is it Eldoret? Okay, which is in Kenya. You're 22, and it says, living alone most of the first month was trying. I missed the disciples in Nairobi. I rented a single room with an earth floor and a corrugated iron sheet roof. My only furniture was a mattress to sleep on and a basin to use for taking cold baths in the morning. My daily routine was simple. Wake up, have my quiet time, buy tea and bread for breakfast in a neighborhood kiosk, and head into town. Once there, I'd simply reach out to people and invite them to study the Bible with me. In the evening, I'd return to the same kiosk for supper, usually beans and greens, and then went back to my room to sleep. I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, okay, I'm assuming that growing up in international schools, you were pretty well off comparatively relative to the general population in Kenya and Ethiopia and Morocco, that you led a fairly privileged life in relative to the general population. But now going back and then planting a church, and then you're living in a dirt floored hut. Okay, I want to know, what do you think about that? What was that like? I mean, that is just so incredible.
You're right, Rob. It was very different from the way I'd grown up. And yeah, there are points like when my dad lived and worked in Ethiopia, we were chauffeur driven. That's what we had. My dad was working for the Organization of African Unity. He was the Assistant Secretary General for Economics. That's the career he carved out for himself. I salute him. And so yeah, this was very different. What happened, by the way, was I had a lull in my faith. And I was looking around me, I was seeing people who just seemed to be doing great for God. They were excited. And, they would reach out to people. People would show up at Bible talk and church, and nothing was happening in my life. And so I did a study on the topic of fear of God. I remember that it changed me. And I reached to the point where I said, I'm ready for anything. I'm ready for a big challenge. I didn't tell anyone, but that's what I said. And within weeks, going to church, I think it was like maybe the first service in January that year. Service ended. Mike Tolliver calls me over afterwards and says, we want to send you to go plant the church in Eldoret. So it happened with a bunch of students who had become Christians in Nairobi. They needed to go back to their university. And their university was close to Eldoret. So that was kind of the impetus to then start the church at that point. So I was going to be in the town of Eldoret. Then those students were going to be over on campus. Then we'd get together every Sunday in, the town of Eldoret. And, but yep, that was it. That's what I was able to rent. And I was totally fine with that, Rob. And I remember people having the same surprise that you've kind of expressed. And some people thought like, no, there's no way Rhysce, not Rhysce. Rhysce is not that's not Rhysce.
Right.
But, I think that's me. And at that point, I just wanted to make disciples. And I feel like that whole setup actually was just helped me to have focused living. You know how the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians, he says, I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That was it. I didn't have much. I wasn't kicking back and watching TV or whatever. It was just wake up, have my breakfast.
Now, did you have Netflix back then?
None. No Netflix.
I guess you weren't binging Netflix at that point.
Not at all. Not at all. I was binging Reach Out.
I love what you write. You said, I guess not too many people expected to run into a one-man church in the form of a 22-year-old college student with no formal theological training. Okay, now this is what inspires me about this, is that, these days it seems like you have to be 35 with a master's degree and, lots of years of ministry experience before you can plant a church. And yet that's not the way it was. I mean, not that we're looking back to the glory days, but what we're capable of doing in terms of converting people and starting a church, not that that's going to be the final form of the church, but to get it going, you don't need to have an advanced degree to get the gospel out there. Any thoughts on that?
I agree. You don't need to have an advanced degree. Advanced degrees help. And, a lot of my friends, one of my best friends was appointed a teacher, in the church several of my friends. One of them was the best man in my wedding, really close buddies of mine. So I'll be the last person to speak against that.
Right.
Okay. Because my very good buddies, they're teachers. They've gotten their master's degrees, doctorates. I also heard your interview with Greg Marutsky that it was really inspiring. And like all the studying he's doing.
Oh my gosh.
So there's a place for that, and an incredible place for that. But like you're saying, you don't need that in order to have an impact.
Right.
And I think you just need to have faith.
Yeah. Right.
I think that's what it takes. And I think it also helps to have a great support system, because it was lonely many times being out there in Eldoret. It was scary. Sometimes I felt the pressure that I've got to report back that I'm having, hundreds of studies and thousands of visitors,
right.
And, things like that, and baptisms every day. And so I felt that pressure, but there was incredible support.
Right.
Much as I was alone there in the town, once a week I'd put a few coins in the phone booth and call back to Nairobi, and I'd get some encouragement.
It's
so
amazing.
That's one thing I think that makes a huge difference, is having amazing women and men, spiritual women and men.
Okay, so now Eldoret, is that in the high country of Kenya? You just talk a little bit about the Kenyan runners at that point.
Yes, it's high altitude, and so that the area around Eldoret, not necessarily just that town itself, but that the area around Eldoret produces an endless stream of long distance runners. They're the ones winning the marathons at the Olympics and New York, Boston marathons, London marathons.
I know it.
10,000 meters. And then so you find a lot of non-Kenyan runners as well go there for training. So yeah, that's a hotbed of just producing.
Right. And so that's really close. Is the Olduvai Gorge runs right through there?
There's
The
there's
Rift, the
there's a
Rift
Rift
Valley.
Valley.
Okay,
So Eldred is in the Great Rift Valley.
got it. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
I've been to Kenya one time back in the mid '90s, and it was beautiful. I mean the weather there is amazing. You're right on the equator, but because of the higher altitude, it's incredible. It's like Southern California or something. In the '70s, seems like just perfect weather. That must have been very nice. Um,
Yeah, it was wonderful. It
okay,
was wonderful.
so you don't stop there. You go to Rwanda in '97, like 3 or 4 years after the mass genocide where a million people were killed. Okay, what was that like? I just go, whoa, you're going from the frying pan into the fire there. Um, the name of the city, Kigali, is that right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
can you
The
talk
capital
about your
city.
experience there?
Sure. In fact, between Eldoret and Rwanda, I also went to Ethiopia. But yeah, about Rwanda, it was scary and it was exciting. What happened was because I had been on mission teams as a single man, and so even when I was single, I said, if I get married, I'd like to do missions with my wife, whoever that wonderful and amazing woman was going to be. I'd like to do missions, and so the opportunity came where we were asked to go to Rwanda. And the thing was that, right, there had been the genocide, there had been the civil war. So there was no Rwanda embassy in Kenya, by the way. So even trying to get a visa was a challenge. We had to go to another country, Uganda, to get our visas. We had no idea what to expect. And the mission team was the two of us. Okay, there's that famous song, Just the Two of Us. Well, that was it, just the two of us. But there was a gentleman in Rwanda that the leaders of the church had come to know. He wasn't a member of our church, but I forget exactly how they came to know him, but they came to know him. So he was the one who was going to like receive us at the airport. And and that was it. Apart from that, he was going to get us to the airport. I mean, receive us at the airport, show us somewhere we could, a little hotel that we could stay in until we could rent a house. And that was it. And but yeah, it was scary just because there was so much was unknown. Like we didn't even know, does the post office work? Do the banks work? It was amazing. And then when we got there was also a lot of negative talk. So I went there as a Kenyan, by the way, all right? So this time I wasn't an undercover Kenyan. I went there as a Kenyan because since I was in East Africa, it just made more sense, even logistically, to not go there as an American, but as a Kenyan. But there was a lot of talk that the Rwandan government did not like Kenyan, or let me say, did not like Kenya, and did not like churches. Why? They felt that Kenya was harboring people who had orchestrated the genocide. So there was hostility because of that. And then also in the genocide, because there had been previous genocide in Rwanda, and at those points, church buildings were sanctuaries. But with this genocide, the one that was in 1994, when people went to churches, church buildings for refuge, those just became slaughterhouses. And people just got massive, like many places out in their homes as well, etc. But churches where everybody expected sanctuary, it's like people were herded there and massacred. So negative talk like that would scare me. Like, so okay, I'm with a church. I'm here as a missionary. I'm from Kenya. Like some people would even tell me, hey, if they know what you're doing here, they're going to kick you out. At one point, I got arrested. At another point, I got summoned over to immigration to write a statement about what I was doing there. I got really questioned. Then there's another time, because what would happen was my wife and I at a certain point would have to get a visa. Again, there was no embassy in Kenya at the time. So we'd have to go and get a 1-month visa. So leave Rwanda, get a visa, come back. And there's one time in Rwanda, they told us, leave the country and don't come back until your church is registered. And guess what? The government was not registering churches. So in effect, they were saying, get out of Rwanda. But it was amazing how the same place where I told you I got summoned at immigration to write a statement. So there were two different immigration offices. So the one where we were told, don't come back until your church is registered, was different from the one where I was summoned to make a statement. So when I went there to make a statement, I mean, I was all fearful. I didn't know what was going to happen. I said some irresponsible things that were kind of even more offensive to them. I think I said something like, when I was called here, I didn't know what was going to happen. So already I'm implying that, they do things with people
Right.
who they don't like. But guess what? That gentleman, and guess what? He had grown up in Kenya. So a lot of the Rwandan people who then came in at the end of the war had grown up around East Africa. So this gentleman had grown up in Kenya. He had been a teacher, and he had been a teacher at my twin brother's high school. And we just connected. And he said, don't worry. I even told him that we were told to go back and not return until the church is registered. He said, don't worry. Just keep getting your visas and keep coming back.
So God placed an angel right there in your pathway.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
And so it was incredible, but it was scary. Like there were marks of war on the buildings. Like the Parliament buildings was pretty much the last stand during the war, and they had deliberately not repaired the walls just as a reminder. And it stands on a hill, and you'd see the walls of the Parliament buildings, and you'd see that this building took shelling, and it was a stark reminder. And you'd see it in the people. People would walk around with some really scary injuries, lifelong injuries. And so I had never experienced that as, as my everyday.
Right.
And that's what Kigali was like.
I got to hand it to you to go into that situation. I remember reading about, hearing about it, and hearing about people importing, thousands and thousands of machetes from China, and just all the murder there and the slaughter. Unbelievable.
International.
Yeah, I don't want to get off the subject too much, but it's just so fascinating. I mean, you're right there in international events, and it's a tiny little country. I mean, it's really close there to Lake Victoria, very small little place. You said it's the land of 1,000 hills or something like that.
Yep.
Very interesting. Okay, so
1,000 beautiful hills.
1,000. And then you got into Hope. I mean, you just kind of took a little side thing, and you got into Hope. Can you talk briefly about that?
Yes, sure. Yeah. So my wife and I ended up working for Hope Worldwide in Kenya. And so what happened was two events happened pretty much at the same time. There was, so within the church, the International Churches of Christ, there was, around 2003, with the letter, a lot of things changed, including support.
Right.
From the, let me just say, bigger congregations. So for example, in Africa, a lot of the support was coming from New York, I believe from Atlanta as well. And so as the financial support dwindled, the church was not able to retain the same, all the staff members, all the full-time ministers. And so, gradually people were being let go, not because they weren't ministering well,
right,
but because there wasn't enough money. And at the same time with Hope Worldwide in Kenya, Hope Worldwide had gotten some funding from the US government, from USAID and also from the CDC to do HIV prevention work. And so that's how my wife and I ended up leaving the full-time ministry and going to Hope Worldwide. The folks at Hope Worldwide, God bless them, felt that my wife and I could maybe make a difference.
Oh yeah.
I didn't think I could. That was again one of my. I'm like, what? Like HIV prevention? Me? And it had its own challenge, but that was their vision, and it ended up being incredible. For me, it was life changing. Just being involved in the HIV response and working with young people and working in HIV prevention.
Wow.
It was incredible. It was amazing. It was life-changing.
Gosh, there's so much to talk about. I want to go back a little bit. Like when you went to Kigali and you said you went to Ethiopia, what kind of support package did you get at the time? I know that there was a big drive to get a church to every country in the continent of Africa. I think there's around 50. I could be wrong. But it didn't seem like there's a lot of financial support there. I mean, you're riding buses to get back to Nairobi. Do you remember what kind of support you received to get that church going when it was just you and George Ann?
Yeah, sure. I think, the folks were, I'd say they did the best they could with what they had. But I'm just glad we went. Honestly, I'm glad we went. I'm glad no one said, hey, I don't think we can do it. Not now. I'm glad we went. I'm glad we were sent. But yeah, I don't know all the background, but yeah, the stream of financial support wasn't always terribly reliable. But again, we were going on faith. Everybody was walking by faith.
Right.
It wasn't that, we had everything figured out and, there was an incredible supply chain or anything. And so, yeah, there were a couple of times we ran out of money. And, I remember jumping on, leaving my wife in Kigali and jumping onto, a bus and, you take one bus to the border and then another bus into Uganda and, coming back to Nairobi looking for money. Then there was no money. So I went to my savings account,
oh my God.
Withdrew some money. Then there's one time, actually, then I didn't even have enough money to leave Rwanda to go look for money. But this same gentleman, the one I told you received us at the airport when we first arrived.
Right.
So he took me to somebody who he knew at the UN. And that person agreed to give me $150.
Wow.
That person had no idea who and $150 in Rwanda, that's a lot of money. And especially in Rwanda back then. But she trusted that I was going to come back and I was going to return the money. And so God always provided,
Wow.
It's, as Guy Hammond says, if it's God's will, it's God's bill.
I love that. That's awesome.
And God came through. There's one time where one of the sisters from the church in Kenya, she came over to Rwanda for business. And so one of her local business partners had money and wanted to donate money. And she's like, well, there's a church here. You could donate to them. He donated $1,500.
Wow.
That was like a king's ransom.
Wow.
And so God was always providing. And so things became more reliable financially later on. But I think everybody was walking by faith. All those challenges just helped us grow.
The thing I appreciate about you is there's a lack of entitlement. You grew up in a privileged background, but there's a lack of entitlement about your lifestyle. That just like, hey, we're going to get the gospel out there no matter what. Very, very impressive, especially reading it. Now, you came back to the States after your time with Hope. What are you doing now, and what are you excited about as you go forward?
Right. So what I'm doing now is several things. So I work at the United Nations. So I'm with the United Nations Population Fund. So that's one of the agencies within the United Nations. And our main mandate is sexual and reproductive health and rights. And then I'm also an adjunct professor at the New Jersey City University School of Management. And so I teach part-time. I teach management. And so one thing I'm excited about and looking forward to, well, one thing that we're doing even right now is the singles ministry. My wife and I were asked a few years ago to help out in the singles ministry. And for me, it's been an honor. It's been exciting, and I'll stay here until they kick me out. So, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but it's not uncommon that singles get overlooked. And yet, I believe that their place in the church is front and center. I believe everyone's place in the church is front and center. But, sometimes I think singles have gotten, somewhat overlooked. And so right now I feel honored to be able to advocate for the singles, to be side by side with them, to do life with them, to learn from them, and just help contribute to singles being celebrated and honored.
Right. I was surprised because as you went through your memoir, there was just seemingly like dropped in a section all devoted to singles, which was like, wow, okay, he's really got a heart here for the singles. It's interesting that you kind of changed track there in the midst of your book as you're talking about your experiences, all of a sudden you focus on really encouraging the singles.
Yes. What happened was, so I pretty much had the book together, and then the publisher, the good people at IPI Books, Illumination Publishers, they said, read through your manuscript again, just anything you might want to tweak. And so as I did that, more new ideas and fresh ideas were coming to my mind. The singles are just so much on my heart.
That definitely came out.
Right. And so where they fit in is, because like you said, the subtitle of my book is Looking Beyond Your Weaknesses to See the Difference Your Life can make. So I'm not saying that it's a weakness to be single. I'm not saying that. But sometimes people can see that as a gap.
Absolutely.
As something missing.
Right.
And single people can look at it that way, or sometimes married people can look at singles as, they're not complete.
Right.
Because they're not married. And my point was and is, listen, being single, or let me say being married doesn't make you more spiritual.
Right.
It doesn't. You're just married, that's all. And being single doesn't make you less spiritual.
Right.
Take the life that you have. Keep dreaming. If it's your goal to get married, amen. Let's keep with that prayer. But we're not waiting to get married in order to do something great.
Right.
David in the Bible did amazing things. He eventually got married, but he didn't wait to get married to do amazing things.
Right.
When he brought down Goliath, he was a single man.
Right.
With a sling and a stone.
I love.
I just have a lot of passion.
I love what you talk about. I say, listen, would you look at Jesus's life or Paul's life and say they're somehow incomplete? I don't think so. But I know what you're saying. There can be that mindset, like I'm not ready. I'm not complete. I'm not 100% yet. And then I will be. And yet, when you look at your life, so much happened prior to you getting married. Now, tell me a little bit, how'd you run into Georgianne? How'd you guys get together?
We got together because she was one of the first people who became a disciple after the church was planted. So, when you're on a mission team, you all know each other. You are the church, you all know each other. And then, a few people start getting baptized and you know them as well. It's a pretty small group there, dynamic, exciting group. And so that's when so that's how I got to know her. Now this is the thing. When
Did you help her out of the baptistry there and just just say, hi, my name?
I did not. Actually, Bob Stia was there. Bob Stia. And in fact, my wife later said that, and she says it to this day, Bob Stia is the brother who most reminds her of Jesus.
Wow.
Now, it would be nice if she said that I was the brother who most reminded her of Jesus. But listen, I'll give Bob that. Bob's awesome. But what happened, actually, the first time I noticed Georgianne, I actually had a negative reaction. It was self-righteous, but it was negative because I knew that she was studying the Bible. You're kind of aware of who's studying the Bible. And I felt like, she was coming to church with a kind of like a long face and she just looked unhappy. And, self-righteous me is saying, hey, she's being presented with discipleship. How can you walk into church looking sad? How can you hang your face? And what was happening was she was working through her decision. I guess that's part of the reason. And so she eventually got baptized. And, we're singles, we're getting to know each other, we go on dates and stuff like that. And then, so one day there was a Christmas event. And so Jim Brown, he was, evangelist there. So he was playing the piano. Frank Davis, that's it. Frank Davis, I think he was on the flute. And then people were gathered around the piano. And I took a picture. I love photography. And I took a picture. And then one day I'm looking at that picture. And in that picture is Georgianne. She's one of the people by the piano. And she has this radiant and glowing smile. Because remember before, my concern was she's always frowning, what's going on? And that actually was the first time I kind of was like, wow, I like her smile. So I can't say we became friends because of her smile, but that kind of, for me, it was a spark that said, I think there might be something there. She just, that smile for me, communicated a lot.
Wow.
And in the end, we became friends. And, so I'd seek advice from, Mike Tolliver was there, and his wife, Amber Sheets. And I remember one of the things, and Bob Stia as well. And I remember one of the things that Mike said was that whoever's going to be your partner in life needs to be your friend. There's got to be a friendship. At least that's how I remember what Mike said.
Right.
Because every other things will pass. The way your wife looks at 25, she's not going to look the same at, I don't know, 65 if the both of you live long enough. Also, this life happens to people. But the one thing, if you have that's going to keep you together is a friendship. And then over time, I asked myself, well, so who is my friend? And I felt like she was, because she was one person, among other things, I felt like, when going on dates, usually it's important to plan the date and have it, it's really well organized and everything. And then at the end, there's a nice card and all that stuff. But she and I could have unplanned dates and have a great time. I remember one time we ended up, I don't know why we were together, but it was raining. And, we weren't driving cars or whatever. So we're like waiting for the rain to stop so we can, get public transportation. And then I went home and I thought, you know what? I just spent whatever that was, an hour just standing, waiting for the rain to end, and had an amazing conversation. And I thought, that's my friend. Right. And so
yeah,
I eventually put a ring on her finger.
Amazing,
yes.
Amazing that you guys went to Rwanda together. You adopted a child together, Paul. That's an inspiring story right there. I just want to wrap it up here and just ask you this question. You wrote this book, Go in the Strength You Have. And I'd like to know, what advice would you give to those who want to make this life count, who may feel like, I'm not equipped, I'm not ready, I'm afraid, I'm not all I need to be. Maybe I don't stack up against people that I compare myself to. What advice would you give so that person can feel like, hey, I lived a life of no regrets? I mean, when I look at your life, Rhysce, I go, whoa. I mean, you lived it. You did it. You took the action. You stepped into it. You faced your fears. Now you're working for the UN. You're a professor. You're writing a book. I go, it's pretty complete. But what would a person need to do if, let's say, they're younger and they're facing those same fears and they're like, I don't think I could do that. I'm just not that type of a person.
Yeah, one thing I'd say is ride the vision that others have for you. And now, before I go into that more, I just wanted to mention that even in the book, and just that whole theme of weakness, for me, it was also an opportunity just to address different themes that some people, not everybody, but some people find difficult to talk about. Like you mentioned, adoption. So my wife and I had challenges, with around fertility. And, to this day, we have not, had a child, born of us. That's a very sensitive topic, infertility. Adoption. Now, in Kenya, adoption was a pretty unpopular thing. There's a lot of stigma around adoption. We adopted our son, Paul. And it was an opportunity to put it out there, to normalize the conversation about things like adoption, about, things like infertility, about being able to embrace your weakness without any sense of shame. Now, it's challenging. It's not easy. My wife and I have had different marital challenges. We went in we decided at one point we did marriage counseling. And sometimes in the church, I had people criticize me. Why are you going for counseling? And that used to be my mindset. If we've got the Bible, why do you need counseling?
Right.
And the way I see it now, counseling is just like mentoring in the church. It's just that your professional counselor and therapist might have additional tools,
right,
that your mentor in the church doesn't have. And so for me, it was an opportunity to talk about some of these challenges, talk about sensitive issues that have happened to us. We're not talking about somebody else. And hopefully give people the space, if there's a challenge that they have in addressing similar or other issues in their lives, that there's space to just, put our weaknesses before God, put our challenges before God, and still live our best life. So that was just one thing I wanted to throw in there, really, regarding the book. And but back to this. For me, that's made a big difference in my life, is writing the vision that others have had for me. And without that, I would never have attended Williams College. I ended up there because my high school track coach in Morocco was an alum of Williams College.
Mm.
And he said, "You can do it. You can get in, and you can be awesome." For me to accept the missionary call as a teenager, that was Jim Brown's vision for me. Even on the mission team, he would just keep spewing all sorts of encouragement. At some point, I thought he was crazy. Like all these things he's saying, like, Rhysce, you can be this and that. But again, it was his vision, becoming a professor. That wasn't my idea. That was the idea of my mentor when I did my MBA. It was his idea. It was his vision for me. Writing a book, having a career in the global response to the HIV pandemic. All those things for me in my life came from writing the vision other people had for me. And so that's really what I would pass on. Is now I know some people are like uber confident, they believe they can do anything. And I, my hat off to people like that. I can't relate to people like that. I know there are people like that. They're just like super confident, but for anybody who's maybe a bit more like me, I would say even when you are lacking vision for yourself, even when you're maybe feeling inadequate or like you don't measure up, ride the vision that others have for you. And that's what Gideon did when he went in the strength that he had. He didn't have vision for himself, certainly not as a leader, but he rode the vision that was given to him. He rode the support, because at every point, when God said, "Go in the strength you have," God was saying, "You'll never walk alone." And in the words in Isaiah 41:13, where God says, "For I am the Lord your God, who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, 'Do not fear, I will help you.'" That's what God is saying when he says, "Go in the strength you have." And so I would encourage anybody in the situation you mentioned, ride the vision that others have.
That's awesome. I loved your book. And if a person wants to get a hold of it, where would they find your book? How could they buy your book?
My book is it's published by Illumination Publishers. And so it's available from Illumination Publishers, and also on Amazon. So it's also on Amazon. If you key in "Going the Strength You Have," it pops up. And then, my name is there, Rhysce Ossanya. So those are two places that you can get it. Through Amazon and also through Illumination Publishers.
Yeah, I thought it was great. I love the pictures. I also love, I love this picture of your great grandfather, Arturo Schomburg. Yeah, can you just, before we wrap up, can you just give a little background on that? You got a very famous ancestor.
Yeah, so Arturo Schomburg, correct, he's my great grandfather. Okay, yeah, he's my great grandfather. So his father was German, and his mom was from the U.S. Virgin Islands. So what happens is there was a German sea merchant called Schomburg, and he met up with this beautiful young lady from the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they ended up having a son. That's Arturo Schomburg. And he was born in Puerto Rico, grew up around Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands. And at one point, as the story goes, I actually have a biography of here in my bookshelf of my great grandfather. But at one point, when he was in school in Puerto Rico, his teacher is said to have made the comment that Black people have no history. And so that set Arturo Schomburg on a course to document and highlight and celebrate the history of Black people, mostly in the diaspora, not so much in Africa. And so he moved from Puerto Rico to New York. He was based in Harlem for a long time. And so he did a lot of research and just collected a lot of literature. And that's why today there's a library named after him It's called the Schomburg Institute for Research in Black Culture. It's pretty much the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. And so that picture there from a stamp. So there was a stamp series, I believe that was in 2020 that was released,
Right.
called Harlem Renaissance. And he was one of 5 people featured. So there's a U.S. Postal Service stamp with my great-grandfather on it.
That's really, really awesome. Well, thank you so much for the time, and thank you for your life and sharing it. It's so encouraging because you're really connecting with something we all feel at times. Like I don't measure up. I'm not as good as that person, whoever that person might be. I don't have what it takes, and yet you have lived it in the sense of pushing past the fear to make this life count. And I just want to wish you all the best, and may your remaining years be even more adventurous and exciting.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you for having me, certainly. I've had a great time talking. I've enjoyed the conversation. I have your book. I just got your book, so I'm looking forward to digging into it. And thank you also for your podcast, because I've listened to several of your interviews, and they're incredibly inspiring. So I wish you the best with your podcast. I wish you the best in what you're doing in Tucson. One of the things, allow me to say this, because one of the things I came across on your podcast was where you had Al Baird come in and just look at the church, be with the church, and I thought that was incredible as a leader, like to open yourself up to that kind of critique. I thought that was just incredibly courageous and humble. So thank you just for your life, for your podcast, and the ministry that your podcast is serving.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining the Rob Skinner podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, please hit the subscribe button and let your friends know about it and how to find it. Because my goal is to inspire you to make this life count, live a no regrets life, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. Have a great day and make this life count.